The twin suns were rising over
Magnifica!
the red horizon of the colony planet, spreading a soft golden glow across the rocky ground. The settlement looked quiet at first glance, but deep inside the outpost, life was always moving. Humans and Cathar worked side by side, two species trying to build a future together. The Cathar were a warrior race, tall and broad, their skin covered in faint stripes that shifted color with their emotions. They lived by honor and strength, and to them, weakness was shameful. Most humans found them frightening. Even after years of peaceful contact, fear still lingered between the two races. But not for Sergeant Daniel Reed. Daniel had been a soldier once, but after years of fighting, he wanted peace more than medals. When the program to help humans and Cathar live together began, he volunteered without hesitation. Everyone warned him that the predators were short-tempered and prideful, that one wrong word could get him hurt. But Daniel didn't see monsters. He saw people. He treated the Cathar the same way he would treat anyone else, with calm respect and quiet humor. When they growled in anger, he stayed steady. When they boasted of their hunts, he listened with interest. Slowly, he became known among them not as the human, but as Reed of Calm Voice. The Cathar adults didn't show affection easily, but their cubs were different. They were curious, loud, and full of mischief. At first, they only watched Daniel from a distance. He was smaller, his skin smooth and pale compared to their rough hides. But he smiled at them every time he caught their eyes. One day, he offered them something strange, a cookie from his ration pack. The cubs sniffed it, suspicious, until one brave little one took a bite. Its eyes went wide, and soon the others were fighting to grab a piece. From that day on, wherever Daniel went, there were always cubs trailing behind him. They followed him when he worked in the hangar, cleaning the small shuttle engines, and when he cooked his meals, watching with fascination as he used fire and spices. The Cathar ate their food raw, believing fire ruined flavor. But Daniel didn't care. He told them stories while he stirred his pot, stories about his home on Earth, blue oceans, green forests, and rain that smelled like new beginnings. The cubs would sit quietly, their bright eyes fixed on him, trying to imagine such a peaceful world. The adult warriors often laughed when they saw their young gathered around a human. "You'll make them soft," they warned him. But Daniel would only smile and reply, "A soft heart doesn't make a weak warrior." His words puzzled them, yet they couldn't deny the quiet respect growing for this human who never raised his voice, never ran, and never looked away when they showed their fangs. As months passed, Daniel became more than a guest in the colony, and he became part of it. The cubs trusted him, the elders nodded to him when he passed, and even the harshest warriors greeted him with a short growl of respect. He didn't try to change the Cathar, and he didn't try to be one of them. He simply lived among them as himself, patient, kind, and unafraid. And though he didn't know it yet, the bond he was building with those curious cubs would soon lead to something unforgettable, a simple act of kindness that would touch hearts across two worlds. For now, though, he sat outside his small quarters, a warm cup of coffee in hand, watching the cubs chase each other through the dust, smiling softly as one of them looked back and called out in their rumbling voice, "Human Reed, tomorrow we cook like you." He laughed, shaking his head. If only he had known what that promise would bring. The next day, the outpost buzzed with its usual noise, machines humming, ships landing, and the deep voices of the Cathar warriors echoing through the halls. But in one corner of the settlement, 3 young cubs were whispering like they were planning the most important mission of their lives. Ree, the oldest, stood with his tail flicking nervously as he whispered, "Today, we make food for Human Reed." Tarek's eyes gleamed with excitement, while the smallest one, Molu, barely managed to stay quiet, his claws tapping on the metal floor in pure energy. They had been talking about this idea since the night before, when they remembered how Daniel had saved them during the great dust storm. He had risked himself to pull them into safety when their path was blocked by falling debris. Since then, they had been thinking of a way to thank him. To a Cathar, showing gratitude was not done with words, but with actions, and what better way to honor someone than by giving them food you made yourself? They had watched Daniel cook so many times. He always seemed calm and patient, waiting for the right moment to stir or flip something in his pan. They didn't understand why he made things so complicated. Fire, pans, spices, measuring everything like it was a battle plan. The Cathar way was simpler: hunt, eat, and move on. But still, something about the way Daniel cooked fascinated them. It was more than food. It was care. So that morning, before the humans started their daily routines, the cubs snuck into the supply room behind the mess hall. The air smelled of metal and old spices, but to them it felt like an adventure. "Okay," Ree whispered, scanning the shelves filled with human and Cathar food supplies. "We need meat, good meat, and those round things he always cuts." "Tubers," Tarek said proudly, remembering the word Daniel once used. He climbed up and pulled down a bag of them, dropping it with a loud thud that made all three freeze in panic. When no one came, they let out a breath of relief and started working faster. Molu grabbed a few herbs that looked interesting, though he wasn't sure what they were. "This one smells sharp," he said, sniffing a green leaf before sneezing. The others laughed quietly. "It'll add flavor," Reed decided, pretending to know what that meant. They also found some small bottles with strange labels, sauces Daniel used sometimes. Tarek read one aloud in his rough voice. "Hot sauce, handle with care." He grinned. "It sounds powerful." The cubs carried everything into the small kitchen area, a place not meant for claws and tails. The room was filled with shiny tools and strange human machines. They had seen Daniel use them, but now, standing in front of them alone, they weren't sure what to do first. Ree pressed a button, and the stove came to life with a burst of flame. They all jumped back, growling in surprise, but then laughed, proud of their bravery. "We are doing this," Ree said, his chest puffed out. They began cutting and mixing everything the way they remembered seeing Daniel do. The problem was none of them actually knew how much of anything to use. Molu poured in far too much sauce, while Tarek tried to turn the meat, but ended up scratching the pan. Smoke began to rise almost immediately. "It's cooking," Molu shouted, wagging his tail. But within minutes, the smell turned from smoky to sharp and bitter. Ree coughed and waved his hand. "Too much fire! Turn it down!" In their panic, they spilled half the tubers onto the floor, and Molu tried to pick them up, but his claws tore them apart. The once clean kitchen was a mess of smoke, splattered sauce, and burned pieces of food. But despite the disaster, they didn't give up. When they finally turned off the fire, they stared at the result. A plate of something blackened, lumpy, and unrecognizable. For a long moment, they were silent. Then Tarek grinned and said, "It looks strong." Ree nodded in agreement. "Human Reed will be proud." They packed it neatly, covering the burned edges with leaves to make it look better. Their hearts raced with both excitement and fear. None of them had ever made food before, but they had done it. They had made something with their own claws. As they carried the plate carefully toward Daniel's quarters, their eyes shone with pride. They had no idea that what they had created would become a story told for years, not because it was good, but because of what it meant. The cubs stood proudly in the kitchen, tails flicking with excitement, their claws clicking against the metal counter. They had seen Daniel do this so many times. How hard could it be? Ree, the oldest, puffed out his chest and said, "We can do this. Fire first." Molu, the smallest and most impatient of the three, scrambled to turn the stove on. He twisted the knob all the way without thinking, and with a sudden whoosh, a tall flame burst to life. The three jumped back with a startled growl, eyes wide. "It's working," Molu said proudly, though his fur stood on end from the heat. Ree nodded with fake confidence. "Good, now the tubers." He tossed the thick pieces into the pan without peeling or cutting them, and soon the flame turned orange, licking at the edges of the food. Tarek, who had been trying to look serious, frowned and sniffed the air. "It smells funny," he muttered. Molu leaned closer and poked one of the tubers with a metal spoon. It was already turning black. "That's flavor," he said cheerfully. But within seconds, the bottom of the pan began to smoke heavily. The smell turned sharp and burned their noses. "Too much fire," Ree shouted. Molu panicked, grabbed the nearest container of water, and threw it straight into the pan. The moment it hit, steam and grease exploded upward with a loud hiss. Hot droplets splattered across the counter, and Tarek ducked, yelling, "You're burning us, not the food!" Smoke poured into the air, rising fast until the small kitchen filled with a thick gray cloud. The cubs started coughing and waving their arms wildly. The smell was so strong that even their predator noses couldn't handle it. Molu's eyes watered, but he still grinned. "It's cooking," he said, his voice half choked by smoke. Ree covered his face and shouted, "Turn it off! Turn it off!" They fumbled with the controls until the flame finally went out. But by then, the damage was done. The tubers were completely charred, black lumps that didn't look edible at all. Still determined, Ree said, "Okay, maybe the meat will fix it." Tarek, the biggest of the three, grabbed a piece of raw meat and dropped it on the hot pan. It sizzled loudly, and for a second they all smiled in satisfaction. But Ree, remembering that Daniel always added things from bottles and jars, reached for the first container he saw. Salt. He shook it once, but nothing came out, so he turned it upside down and slammed it on the counter. The lid came loose, and half the container spilled straight onto the meat. Instantly, the sizzling turned strange, almost squealing. "That's a lot of flavor," Tarek said nervously. The smoke alarm suddenly began to beep, a loud, high-pitched sound that made all three cover their ears. "It's angry!" Molu shouted, glaring at the little red light on the wall. They didn't know how to stop it, so Ree grabbed a towel and started waving it in the air, trying to push the smoke away. The beeping only got louder. Somewhere outside, a Cathar guard shouted, "What's happening in there?" The cubs froze. Panic flashed across their faces. "We must hurry," Ree said, "before someone stops us." They rushed to finish their masterpiece. Molu tried to scrape the tubers off the pan, but they broke apart into black crumbs. Tarek used a fork, which bent immediately under his strength, and dropped half the meat on the floor. Ree picked up what was left, arranging it on a plate that was too small to hold everything. The result looked like something from a battlefield. Blackened pieces, sticky sauce, and ash sprinkled like seasoning. Finally, the smoke alarm went silent, leaving only the faint hiss of the cooling stove and their heavy breathing. The cubs stood back, looking at their creation. The smell was so strong that even they hesitated to breathe deeply. Molu tilted his head, tail swaying uncertainly. "It looks powerful," he said. Ree nodded seriously. "It shows effort." Tarek sniffed the plate and winced. "Do you think he'll eat it?" he asked. Ree hesitated, then said firmly, "He is human Reed. He will." They found an old serving tray, carefully placing the burnt meal on top. Ree covered it with a clean napkin, the only thing that looked nice, and all three of them stood in silence for a moment. Despite the disaster, pride sparkled in their eyes. Their fur was covered in ash. The kitchen looked like a storm had passed through it, but in their hearts they felt like heroes. "For the human," Ree whispered softly. The others repeated the words, their voices small but full of meaning. They lifted the tray together and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the smoky chaos, and unknowingly, walking straight toward a moment that would become a story remembered forever. When Daniel entered the mess hall that afternoon, he was expecting a quiet lunch and maybe a few minutes of peace before work started again. But instead of calm, he walked straight into a strange scene. The air smelled of something burnt, not just a little burnt, but the kind of smell that sticks to the walls. Several Cathar adults were gathered near the center, whispering and laughing under their breath. Daniel frowned slightly and followed their eyes, and that's when he saw them, Ree, Tarek, and little Molu, standing near a table with a metal tray in front of them. They were covered in soot, streaks of gray across their fur and patches of flour dusting their claws and tails. Molu even had a streak of sauce on his ear. At first, Daniel thought they had gotten into trouble again, maybe another one of their curious experiments gone wrong. He started walking toward them quickly, concern written on his face. "Are you three all right?" he asked, his voice calm but worried. The cubs turned toward him, their golden eyes wide with both pride and fear. Ree straightened immediately, his small chest puffing out in determination. "Human Reed," he announced loudly. "We made food. For you!" The room went silent for a second, and Daniel blinked, confused. "You made food?" "For me?" he asked, trying not to laugh in surprise. He glanced at the tray on the table. It was covered by a napkin, but the faint smell of burnt spices told him enough. Tarek nodded quickly, his tail twitching nervously. "We cook, Like you. To thank you. Molu looked up at him shyly, still holding a wooden spoon like a trophy. Daniel's heart softened instantly. He understood what this meant. The Cathar were not a sentimental species. They showed gratitude through action, not words. For these 3 cubs to make something for him, even if it looked more like an accident than a meal, was a gesture of deep respect. Around them, a few Cathar adults began to chuckle quietly, whispering things like, "Let's see if the human dares to eat it," and "He'll run from the smell alone." But Daniel didn't mind the laughter. He smiled softly, stepped closer to the cubs, and asked, "You made this all by yourselves?" Ree nodded proudly, his fur still matted from smoke. "Yes, no help. All us." Daniel's eyes warmed with admiration. He could see how hard they had tried, their faces anxious but glowing with pride. He knew they expected him to laugh or refuse, but that was never in his heart. "Then it's the best kind of meal," he said gently. He reached out, lifted the napkin, and saw the disaster beneath. Blackened meat, burned tubers, and what looked like half a bottle of sauce pooled at the bottom. The sight made a few soldiers nearby snicker louder, but Daniel just smiled. "It looks perfect," he said, and pulled out a chair. The cub's eyes widened. "You will eat it?" Tarek asked, almost in disbelief. Daniel nodded. "Of course. You worked hard. It's an honor." He picked up a piece of the meat with his fork, and as he lifted it, a little puff of smoke rose. The crowd around them watched, half in amusement, half in disbelief. Daniel took a breath, smiled again at the cubs, and put the bite in his mouth. It was awful. The texture tough, the taste overwhelmingly salty, and the hint of burned grease lingering. But he didn't flinch. He chewed slowly, then nodded with a small grin. He said softly. "You added extra seasoning, didn't you?" The cubs looked at each other in surprise, their tails flicking happily. "Yes, we make it strong," Ree said proudly. Daniel chuckled, swallowing hard but keeping his expression warm. "I can tell. Strong flavor for a strong cook." Around him, the laughter in the room faded into quiet. The other Cathar began to watch differently now, not mocking but curious. They had expected him to reject the food, to scold the cubs or at least push it away. Instead, he ate another bite and another, his smile never fading. The cubs stood taller, their fear melting into pride. By the time he finished the small plate, the mess hall was completely silent. Daniel set the fork down, wiped his mouth, and said, "That was wonderful. You 3 did something brave today." Ree blinked, surprised. "Brave?" he repeated. Daniel nodded. "Yes, trying something new takes courage. And sharing it? That's even harder." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one of the older Cathar warriors gave a short, respectful nod. The cubs looked at each other, their tails curling in joy. Molu whispered quietly, "He ate it all." And Daniel leaned down with a smile. "Of course I did," he said softly. "You made it for me." In that simple moment, surrounded by smoke, laughter, and warmth, Daniel had done something more powerful than any speech. He had turned their small act of chaos into a lesson in love and courage. Daniel looked down at the plate in front of him, pretending to study it like a fine meal. In truth, the food looked like something rescued from a campfire. The meat blackened around the edges. The tubers, a strange gray color, and an oily sauce pooling at the bottom like a mystery experiment gone wrong. The smell was sharp and salty, stinging his nose. But when he looked up, he saw 3 hopeful faces staring at him. Ree, Tarek, and Molu stood perfectly still, their tails twitching nervously, waiting for his reaction. Their eyes, bright and full of pride, reminded him of children bringing their first drawing to show an adult. There was no way he could let them down. So he smiled, picked up his fork, and said warmly, "Well then, let's see what my favorite chefs have made today." The cubs' ears perked up at the word chefs, their anxiety replaced by excitement. Around the room, the older Cathar warriors had gathered, pretending not to watch but clearly paying attention. A few whispered quietly, expecting the human to take one bite and give up. Daniel took a deep breath, then picked up a small piece of the charred meat and placed it in his mouth. The flavor hit him instantly. burned on the outside, raw in the middle, and so salty his eyes watered. But he didn't flinch. He forced himself to chew slowly, nodding thoughtfully like he was tasting something complex and refined. He said at last, swallowing hard. That's an interesting flavor. You added something smoky, right? Molu's eyes lit up, his small claws tapping against the table. Yes, we make it smoky on purpose, he said proudly. Daniel smiled, though his tongue felt like it was under attack. Well, you certainly did, he replied warmly. That's a brave flavor, strong and bold. Tarek tilted his head, unsure if that was a compliment, but when he saw Daniel smiling, his tail wagged slightly. Daniel took another bite, this time of the tubers. They were tough, almost like chewing old leather, but he didn't make a sound of complaint. He just kept chewing, smiling between bites and occasionally nodding as though he were enjoying a fine dinner. You like it? Molu asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked straight at him and said honestly, I love it. Because it came from you. His tone was gentle, filled with sincerity. Those words froze the cubs for a moment. They didn't fully understand human ways, but they understood that tone. It was the same one Daniel used when he praised them for bravery or kindness. Their nervousness melted into joy. Ree straightened his shoulders proudly. Tarek grinned wide enough to show his small fangs, and Molu almost bounced in place, tail curling from happiness. Daniel continued eating, bite after bite, until the plate was empty. Every chew was a small act of courage, but to him it was worth it. He knew how much this meant to them. Around the mess hall, silence began to replace laughter. The Cathar soldiers, who had been smirking now, watched quietly. They realized what was happening. This wasn't a human being polite. This was a human showing respect in a way that even their own kind sometimes forgot. In Cathar culture, rejecting food from cubs was an insult that could shame them. But Daniel wasn't just being respectful. He was honoring them as equals, as young hearts who had given him the best they could. When he placed the fork down, he gave a soft laugh and said, "That was a feast fit for a warrior." The cubs glowed with pride. "We make again tomorrow?" Ree asked hopefully. Daniel chuckled, rubbing his stomach. "Maybe after I recover," he joked kindly, earning a round of laughter from the older warriors. Even the captain, who had been silently observing, gave Daniel a short nod of respect, the kind only given to someone who had earned it through action, not words. In that moment, the smell of smoke and burnt spices no longer filled the room. Something else did. It was quiet admiration. The cubs had tried to show love through food, and Daniel had answered with the same language, kindness. As he stood up and ruffled Ree's hair with a smile, he said softly, "You three have good hearts. Don't ever lose that." The cubs beamed, their eyes full of warmth and pride. And for the first time, the entire mess hall saw what made humans so different. Not strength, not skill, but the simple, powerful choice to be kind, even when kindness came with a taste you'd never forget. The story of what happened in the mess hall spread faster than fire across the outpost. By the next morning, almost everyone on the colony had heard about it. Workers, soldiers, and even the high-ranking officers were whispering about the human who ate the cubs' cooking and survived. Some laughed at first, but most spoke with genuine surprise. They couldn't believe Daniel had eaten every bite of what the cubs made without a single complaint. To the Cathar, it wasn't just about the food. It was about what it meant. A human, one of the small, soft creatures they often saw as fragile, had shown more heart and humility than many of their own warriors. When Daniel walked through the colony that day, something felt different. The looks he used to get, half curious, half dismissive, had changed. The warriors nodded to him as he passed, their expressions more respectful than before. One of them, a large Cathar named Varric, clapped him lightly on the shoulder and said with a grin, "You must have a stomach of steel." "Human Reed?" Daniel laughed softly and replied, "Maybe, but it was the best meal I've had in a long time." Varric blinked in surprise, not expecting such sincerity. "You truly mean that?" he asked. "Of course," Daniel said simply. Those cubs gave me their effort and heart. That's worth more than any feast. For a species that valued strength above all else, his words struck a chord they didn't expect. Meanwhile, the cubs couldn't stop talking about it. Ree, Tarek, and Molu retold the story to anyone who would listen, their tails swishing proudly as they declared, "The human ate our food and lived." Each time they told it, the details grew funnier. The fire got bigger, the smoke thicker, the sauce hotter, but one thing stayed the same. Their pride in Daniel never faded. They spoke about how he smiled through every bite and called their meal brave. To them, that was heroism. They followed him everywhere after that, like little shadows, boasting to every adult who passed, "He is not afraid of anything, not even our cooking." The Cathar elders, who rarely involved themselves in such small matters, heard the story too. One evening, a few of them came to the human quarters to meet Daniel. They were old and wise, their scales dark with age and their voices deep and slow. One of them spoke thoughtfully. "Human Reed, you showed great honor to our young ones. You could have shamed them but chose patience instead. That is rare among warriors." Daniel smiled humbly, shaking his head. "They were just trying to thank me. I couldn't turn that away." Another elder, her golden eyes shining softly, added, "Perhaps your kind strength is not in claws or size, but in spirit. You teach without fighting." Those words lingered in the air long after they left. In the following days, something quietly shifted in the colony. The walls that had once divided the two species began to thin. Human workers found the Cathar more open to conversation, and soldiers who once looked down on them started inviting them to join meals. The cubs became small ambassadors of this new friendship, often teasing older warriors by saying, "You should cook for the human next." It became a running joke across the outpost, but beneath the laughter was a sense of warmth and connection that hadn't been there before. For Daniel, it wasn't about fame or praise. He didn't see himself as a hero. To him, it had just been the right thing to do, to be kind, to show gratitude, and to protect the hearts of those who trusted him. But for the Cathar, it became something much bigger. They began to see that courage didn't always roar in battle or show its teeth. Sometimes it spoke softly through small acts that carried deep meaning. They realized that true strength could also live in gentleness, a lesson they had never expected to learn from a human. And so, across the colony, the phrase began to spread, first as a joke, then as a truth whispered with respect. The human ate the fire food and taught us what courage really tastes like. Weeks passed, and the story of Daniel and the cubs had become something everyone in the colony knew. It was told in the dining halls, in the training fields, even whispered by the little ones who giggled each time someone mentioned the fire food. The tale had become a small legend, not about what was eaten, but about what it had changed. So when the Cathar chief decided to hold a great community feast to honor both species, it surprised everyone when Daniel's name was on the guest list. No human had ever been invited to such an event before. The feast was a sacred tradition, a time when warriors, elders, and cubs came together to share stories and meals that celebrated unity. Inviting a human wasn't just unusual. It was history being written quietly in the heart of the colony. When the evening came, the air was filled with the smell of spices and roasted meat. The great fire pit in the center of the settlement glowed bright orange, and the night sky above shimmered with distant stars. Daniel arrived wearing his simple uniform, feeling both honored and slightly nervous. The Cathar warriors stood taller as he passed, greeting him with respectful nods. "Welcome, Human Reed," said the chief, his deep voice carrying warmth. "Tonight, we share one fire." Daniel smiled, placing his hand over his heart, a human gesture of thanks. "It's my honor to be here," he said softly. To his delight, the first ones to greet him were none other than Ree, Tarek, and Molu. The three cubs came running, tails wagging with excitement. They were a little taller now, their fur cleaner than usual, but their eyes still shone with the same mischievous joy. "Human Reed?" Molu called proudly, holding up a tray. "We cooked again." Daniel laughed out loud, unable to hide his surprise. "You did? And the kitchen still stands?" he teased, pretending to look around for smoke. The cubs giggled and puffed up proudly. "This time we had help," Ree said, pointing toward a group of older Cathar cooks who smiled knowingly from the fire pit. As Daniel took a plate, he noticed how different everything looked. The food wasn't burnt or over-seasoned. It was colorful and beautifully arranged, roasted meats, tender roots, and spices that made his mouth water. "This looks incredible," he said honestly. The cubs waited, holding their breath as he took the first bite. The flavors burst in his mouth, rich, savory, perfectly cooked. His eyes widened and a big grin spread across his face. "You didn't even burn the kitchen this time," he joked, and the cubs erupted into laughter. The nearby warriors who had been listening also roared with amusement, their deep voices rumbling like thunder. For a moment, the entire camp echoed with laughter, not as predators and prey, not as aliens and humans, but as friends. The feast continued late into the night. Warriors shared stories of battle while humans shared tales of Earth, of oceans, forests, and strange little creatures called dogs that made everyone laugh. The cubs sat proudly beside Daniel, handing out food to the guests and telling anyone who would listen that they had learned to cook the human way. The chief raised his cup and said, "Tonight 2 fires burn as one, the flame of strength and the flame of heart." Everyone cheered, and Daniel felt something warm inside him. It wasn't pride. It was belonging. He looked around and saw faces once filled with suspicion now glowing with joy. Cathar and humans eating side by side, trading stories, teasing, and laughing. It wasn't any grand agreement or signed treaty that had brought them together. It was something much smaller and much stronger. A simple act of kindness, shared over a burned meal, had done what politics never could. As the night went on, Daniel sat quietly, watching the cubs help serve the elders, their laughter ringing through the air. He thought back to that first day when smoke had filled the kitchen and chaos had ruled, and he smiled. Who would have guessed that a few burned tubers and too much salt would lead to this peace, laughter, and unity among 2 worlds? He took another bite of the perfectly cooked meal and whispered to himself, "Sometimes the best things start with a little bit of fire." The twin suns were setting over the wide, copper-colored plains, casting long golden shadows across the colony. The day was ending in peace and laughter filled the air. Daniel sat on a low rock near the edge of the settlement, watching Ree, Tarek, and Molu run across the open field. Their sharp claws kicked up small clouds of dust as they chased one another, their playful growls echoing like music. It was a simple sight, but it warmed his heart more than anything else. A few months ago, these same cubs had nearly set a kitchen on fire trying to cook him a meal. Now they were stronger, wiser, and more confident, not because of lessons he had taught with words, but because of moments shared through understanding and trust. The wind blew softly, carrying the faint smell of the evening fires where families gathered to eat. The colony had changed in ways Daniel hadn't expected. Humans and Cathar now worked together more easily, laughed together, and even shared recipes. The once clear line that had divided the 2 species had blurred into friendship. Daniel didn't see himself as the reason for it all. He thought he had just been in the right place at the right time, doing what felt right. But to the Cathar, his kindness had become something much greater. As Daniel watched the cubs tumble over each other, an elder approached quietly. The old Cathar's movements were slow, his eyes calm with the wisdom of many seasons. He stopped beside Daniel and looked at the cubs with a faint smile. "They are different now," the elder said, his deep voice gentle. Daniel turned to him, curious. The elder continued, "You changed them, human Reed. You reminded predators what gentleness looks like." His words carried both gratitude and wonder. Daniel paused, thinking for a moment before replying, "Maybe, but they changed me too. They reminded me that kindness survives anywhere, even among claws and fangs." The elder nodded thoughtfully, his golden eyes soft. "That is the kind of strength no blade can cut," he said, before turning away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Daniel lay back and stared up at them. He thought about his time on this world, the laughter, the mistakes, the shared meals, and the moments of quiet understanding. He realized that peace hadn't come from grand speeches or strong weapons. It had come from something simple, choosing to be kind when it was easier not to be. That single choice had started everything. Over the years that followed, the story of that burned meal spread far beyond the colony. Cathar warriors told it around their fires, adding their own touches to the tale. Some said the human had eaten food so spicy it could melt metal. Others claimed the fire had nearly swallowed him whole. But every version ended the same way, with the human who smiled, ate every bite, and turned an awkward meal into a moment of unity. The story became legend told to young warriors as a lesson in humility and heart. It was said that no warrior was truly strong until they could show mercy and kindness, even to those weaker than themselves. The cubs who once struggled to cook grew into respected warriors and teachers. They carried Daniel's lesson with them, repeating his simple words whenever they taught the young ones. Kindness is not weakness. It's courage you carry in silence. As time passed, a small statue was built near the mess hall, not of a soldier or a fighter, but of a human sitting with a smile, a plate in front of him, and 3 little Cathar cubs standing proudly beside him. Travelers from other worlds often asked what it meant, and the locals would answer with pride. That's the story of the human reed, the one who ate every burned bite. On nights when the air was still and the stars shone bright, Daniel sometimes walked past that statue, his hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face. He never saw himself as a hero. To him, it had always been a small act of kindness. But somewhere deep down, he knew that small act had built something lasting. He looked up at the sky one last time and whispered to himself, "Maybe kindness really is the strongest thing we have?" The wind carried his words softly into the night, across the alien plains, where they would live on, not as history but as heart.